This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country and join their calls for justice. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
This week, Inside the Greens. We take you inside the Greens. Unofficially. Inside the Greens. With the unofficial Greens Party podcast, Serious Danger.
Inside Greens.
Yeah,
Greens.
inside the Greens. Inside. That's right. Hey, patrons. Happy New Year? Question mark. Yes, we're recording this before it's the new year, but hope it's good. Hope it's a great year. This is, of course, not an official Greens Party podcast produced by Michael Griffin. You know that. To start your year off right, we're back with another installment of our longest reading series ever. We're reading Paddy Manning's Inside the Greens, and we're on to part 2 of chapter 7, Turning the Corner.
Turning the corner.
Tom, would you like to recap what happened in part 1 of chapter 7, just quickly, for those who missed it?
Part 1 of chapter 7, Turning the Corner. So each sort of chapter is a new federal election. So the last election that we looked at was 1998. We're moving towards the 2001 election in this chapter. And the first half of this, what we talk about? We talk about Lee Rhiannon getting involved, tension between the New South Wales Party and the Australian Greens Party, a bit of that. We talked about the Global Greens, the big old conference. Ralph Nader got a mention, I remember, anti-globalization, and a few good results in Western Australia, maybe?
Yes, and Queensland as well even was looking kind of good, even though that part of the party was still struggling. One thing you didn't mention when I went and was reading this chapter is the Liberal breakaway groups, like Liberals for Forests, and there was Liberals for Forests, Doctors for Forests, Lawyers for Forests.
Oh, my Lord.
And the Liberals for Forests candidate, one of them was a future Greens MLC, Diane Evers. So, yikes, dog. But the original Teals, clearly.
Yikes.
Anyway, this episode, part 2 of chapter 7, we are, yes, as you say, we're heading towards the 2001 election. We're going to chat about the lead up to that and then what happened and the kind of regrouping and more reflecting after that. We also have the Tampa crisis, refugees, 9/11, war on terror, etc. And as the party kind of grows and matures in a way, I guess how Bob Brown's just like freestyling leadership starts to sit a little bit more strangely. For example, just randomly telling a journalist that, we might consider selling off Telstra if you save the trees, which got him into a bit of trouble. So let's get into it. It is the lead up to the 2001 federal election. Paddy Manning says, in short, something was going right for the Greens and the party realised it was on a roll. Membership had jumped by 60% between 2000 and 2001.
That's crazy.
Particularly, that's massive. I mean, obviously it's easier to get a bigger proportionate jump when you've got a smaller base that you're working from, of course.
Shut up.
However, it's huge, and a big part of the dynamic at play with the Greens growing at this time seems to be like the Democrats are dying, and so the Greens are coming in to occupy that space. And the Democrats had just supported the government's GST, and people are starting to turn away from them on that basis already.
Because that was their entire basis for existing. Well, not their entire basis for existing, but they made that a very big point that we don't like the GST. We will oppose that. We'll keep those bastards honest. Oh, no, wait, we will help them pass this regressive tax.
They became the bastards. In the book, Paddy Manning cites a comment that Bob Brown made to Drew Hutton, who was one of the founders of the Queensland Greens, about the Democrats' strategy being wrong. Quote, if you're going to hang in close to the Liberal Party and mitigate their policies, rather than hanging close and mitigate Labor's, you're actually starting from such a low base on things like the GST or industrial relations that you're going to get yourself in trouble. I thought that, yes, I agree with that. I also think, though, it's an interesting quote because could you not make the same kind of argument about a strategy of, quote, hanging in close to Labor and like mitigating their policies? Yeah. If they're, especially now, starting from such a low base that you're always going to get yourself in trouble? I don't know.
Well, as Manning points out, it's like this is as close as Bob Brown has ever come to admitting that the Liberal and Labor parties are not equally contemptible. Now, we've talked about this a lot on the show. Oh, they're just as bad as each other. No, there are actual differences. Of course, the Greens would support a Labor government over a Liberal one. The idea that you can play these two off when they're so, ideologically different in many respects, even though they agree on a lot, right?
Sure.
And our critiques of, saying when they do agree is important. And it's important to recognize how little distance there is between them on a bunch of things, most notably things like border protection, accepting money from massive donations, maintaining capitalism, etc. But I mean, I still think that's true. That observation is still true, right?
Yeah. And if you believe that it's a choice between like influencing one major party or the other, then obviously that's a very valid point.
Yes, and 20 years ago, I mean, that was the political terrain was much more, was closer to that vision. It's still dominated by two major parties, at least the way we talk about it and think about it. But yes, we know that the vote for not those two people is getting higher and higher every election cycle.
Yeah.
Because people fucking hate them.
Yes. But at this point, yes, the Greens little babies starting to grow up. There's one part in the book, apparently we just like hadn't been submitting audited annual reports, and this new treasurer comes in and is like, okay, guys, we need to start doing this. And we start thinking carefully about who are going to be our candidates to contest the 2001 federal election, where maybe we're going to win big and we're going to do it this time. Bob Brown is very optimistic. He apparently had this, like his strategy, Bob Brown, and at the time, I guess, I don't know when we actually moved to Democratic pre-selection. I don't know if you know the answer to that, Tom, but clearly at this time, candidates were not democratically pre-selected by members of the branch. Bob Brown, it seems, could come in and just go, this will be our candidate. Thank you very much. And he was very keen on getting people from outside the existing membership. And he wanted like high-profile candidates. He wanted tennis star Pat Rafter.
This was crazy to me.
Who is this guy?
Do you know Pat Rafter?
No, I don't know tennis.
Oh, okay, right. I mean, when I was growing up, with a vague interest in it, I played a little bit of tennis and would watch the Australian Open, and Pat Rafter was like, he was the guy,
Okay.
He didn't sleep with Paris Hilton like Mark Philippoussis, but he was still like quite a sex symbol, a celebrated Australian tennis player. I do remember something about him having like decent politics, maybe on environmental questions, but I never realized that he was sort of in the mix at all or considered as a potential Greens candidate. That's very interesting.
Yeah. Bob Brown apparently also handpicked some candidates over members' choice. So, like, the members had pre-selected this midwife, Sally Ann Brown, but he goes, no, we need the president of the, quote, Organics Federation, Scott Kinnear. Like, I don't know. While at the same time saying, oh, it's so important that we have gender balance. Apparently he played a hand in getting recognizable names like Kate Fairman, Rachel Seward were both pre-selected ahead of this election. So anyway, we're preparing to come up and win the election with all these wonderful candidates.
Yeah, I mean, he said, again, the line here, choosing candidates always and only from among the branch members was a perennial prescription for losing, he said.
I mean,
I don't know, pre-selecting a midwife seems like that
sounds great.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
The Democratic endorsement, that would be good.
Like, the idea is that you bring people into the party who are going to be good candidates. You don't just go, there's the members, and then these are the people who are good enough to run.
Right.
I don't know. Yeah. The National Council decided on 3 key issues for the Greens for the federal election in this order. Number 1, forests. Number 2, global warming. Number 3, education. Apparently, New South Wales wasn't happy. What's new? What do you reckon? But they didn't block consensus. They were like, fine, but we want it recorded. We're unhappy. Classic. What do you reckon New South Wales wanted? They maybe wanted the
end
reverse
of capitalism?
Or something. Yeah, I guess that's right. Like, what is missing from this? Anything about economic or social justice. I mean, maybe education is kind of those things, but...
Yeah, I mean, again, it's that tradition. Again, we've looked at where the New South Wales Greens came from, their priorities. I mean... Again, forests are important, undeniably. And of course Bob Brown thinks that. He is a tree.
Yes.
But...
biased.
Yes, if you were making a pitch for mass appeal, if you wanted to say, we are the party that represents the interests of most people and we fight for good things, you can't allocate forests as your number one priority. That just doesn't make sense.
Well, It was their number one priority. However, as Paddy Manning says, quote, whatever the party had hoped, the issue dominating politics that year was refugees. Now, this is the
and how great they are, right? Everyone was debating how much we love them and welcome
like,
they are.
thank you and welcome, and we hope you're safe now. This was one of the things that helped me understand Australian politics a little bit better. I spoke when we did the deep dive into the 2007 election. I spoke about the project that I did for uni, where you look at two elections. My other election was 2001, and so I was like, damn, all that. Really? Okay. And the Tampa crisis is obviously a big part of that. So in 2001, 3,000 people arrived in Australia by boat. Sorry, in 2000, 3,000 people arrived in Australia by boat. In 2001, it was 5,500. Many are coming from Iraq and Afghanistan. There's also, and Paddy Manning gets into this a little bit, refugees coming to Australia as a result of violence in East Timor or Timor-Leste following their referendum on independence from Indonesia. Despite Alexander Downer, who was the foreign minister at the time, telling Bob Brown in a meeting that there'd be no bloodshed, there would be no need to intervene, things are going to be fine. And then later on, it seems that the UN had to actually ask Australia to please intervene because things were not fine. And John Howard, it seems, has tried to kind of retrospectively rewrite history on this and say, yes, we stood up and made the decision to go over and help, when that, according to Bob Brown at least, very much not the case.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I thought that was really interesting. I'll be honest, my ignorance of this part of history is pretty massive.
Oh, me too.
I've heard about the Balibo Five, and I just don't know much about the politics of Timor-Leste and such. I know that Indonesia's, yes, and Australia's relationship with Indonesia over the years, particularly in the 50s and 60s when we were helping them basically just kill leftists across the board and try and suppress communists in that country and all that. I think it's fascinating. I'd love to learn more about it. But yes, interesting that Bob Brown was in Parliament up there, and he moved a motion supporting Timor-Leste's independence, right?
And
which
this is
caught Howard by surprise.
Yeah, well, and this is the point that Paddy Manning's trying to make, is that Bob Brown was very consistent on the Greens were very consistent on this, not just environmental issue. This issue was of, I guess, geopolitical, international justice, global justice.
Yeah, totally.
This is right around the time, of course, that Pauline Hanson starts calling for turnbacks of boats that are entering Australian waters with asylum seekers. And then right before the election, we have the Tampa crisis. The 27th of August, 2001, media reports, quote, suggested that a Norwegian container ship, the MV Tampa, had rescued some 433 Afghan refugees from their distressed fishing boat and proceeded to take them to the closest suitable port, Iraq in Indonesia, as the law of the sea required. But the refugees had threatened that they would jump overboard unless the captain took them to Christmas Island, which was much closer but did not have a wharf big enough for the Tampa to dock at. John Howard refused to allow the Tampa to enter Australian waters. At the time, in Parliament, Labor put on the record that they supported the Liberal government's actions.
Oh, wow.
The Greens, on the other hand, straight off the bat, held a press conference calling it out for what it was. They said it was an embrace of Pauline Hanson's policy proposal, quote, harsh, inhuman, and going to create a rising resentment with other governments as well as many people who are more humanitarian within the Australian community. The book obviously presents this, and I think a lot of people think it is, as a big turning point for the Greens. Do you still feel that that's the case?
Yeah, I think so. Well, again, Paddy Manning mentions this idea of Tampa Greens, right? A whole bunch of people that for this, there was something of a red line for them, the way that they saw Labor particularly respond to this situation heartlessly, callously, Kim Beazley just sort of folding, barely being prepared to stand up for human rights and for these people. There was footage, of these people, these women, lots of women and children who were sitting out on the deck in the hot sun, who were clearly just desperate and in need of help that we could provide.
Yeah.
And Australia said no. John Howard tried to paint these people as dangerous and smear them. And the Greens were the only ones saying, this is wrong. What are you talking about? Of course we can help these people. We have a moral obligation to do so.
Yeah, I actually just realized, because what I had kind of learned about this as was the children overboard affair, because there was another side to this, right, where there were photos published of children being, thrown or jumping overboard from this ship, published as evidence of, look how, inhuman and how horrific these people are, these asylum seekers. They're throwing their children overboard. And that's how it was presented in media, when obviously as it turned out, this was like, people seeking, like trying to escape in act of desperation, right?
Yes. The children were in the water through no deliberate attempt by people seeking asylum. They love their children because they're fucking human beings, not evil devils.
And then they were rescued, and then Australia was like, no, we can't help you.
Yes. Yeah, and was misrepresented and used for political gain, yes. And I think Peter Reith described it as a stuff-up in the end, but it was like, no, this is a deliberate strategy
had such a huge impact.
Government of dinosaurs, of vampires. But that was a separate boat to Tampa.
That was separate. That's what I was like, that was separate to Tampa, right?
Yes. A lot of this happened around the same time, but literally just a different boat.
Okay, yes. But this is clearly, it's like very much coming to a boil at this point. Apparently, whether it's a turning point for the Greens, I mean, Paddy Manning says in the book that later some sort of review in the party found that 1 in 5 new members from 2001 to 2003 were ex-Labor members who were, quote, disgusted at their party's abandonment of principle, particularly on Tampa.
Yeah. I think my mum and dad might be, well, they didn't become
Tampa
members
Greens.
necessarily, but they certainly started to change their vote, and was just clearly
interesting.
There's a great quote from Alex Patel there about that's why she joined the party, because she saw this happening on the news. She was breastfeeding her oldest child, saw Bob Brown on TV, and was like, fucking hell, fuck anyone who can't recognize this for what it is. I think it's very funny when Paddy Manning paints the picture of Bob Brown getting the message from Ben Oquist, and he's like, Ben calls me out of the most important meeting confronting the Senate, and he's saying, the ship's come in. And I said, what? And went back with him and sat in our lounge while he explained what was happening. And he said, I think we should put out a press release. And I said, no, Ben, I think we should hold a press conference.
Yes. Wow.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, even though some people were like, yes, absolutely, this is the only logical and humane way to approach this, the polls at the time showed a majority of Australians were supporting Howard's approach. He was using this rhetoric, quote, I believe it is in Australia's national interest that we draw a line on what is increasingly becoming an uncontrollable number of illegal arrivals in this country. Just horrific stuff. As as we said, a lot of the asylum seekers that were on board of this ship were in really poor health. Over 48 hours, the captain is repeatedly making requests to the Australian authorities for assistance. The requests were acknowledged but not acted on, and so the captain decides, fuck it, we're going to enter Australian waters. Ultimately, though, after they did that, Howard sends in SAS troops to board and stop them from breaching Christmas Island. On the very same day, he moves the Border Protection Bill. It wasn't in the book. I went and had a look. Do you know what this bill initially would have done? Because it didn't end up passing, obviously.
Oh, no. Remind me. I've read and Dark Victory is an amazing book that people by David Marr and Marion Wilkinson, if people are really interested in this, would highly recommend reading Dark Victory, that recounts the whole shebang of the 2001 election and particularly these issues surrounding boats. But no, remind me, what was the Border Protection Bill?
Well, it seems like it basically didn't end up passing the Senate. Labor didn't support it in the Senate because it was like an overreach of powers, gave the government kind of unreasonable powers. It would have provided the government with the power to remove any foreign ship in Australian territorial waters. It was backdated to give retrospective authority for the boarding of the Tampa, and ensure that no Australian court could review the actions or directions of an Australian military officer.
That's right, yeah. It was great.
A little bit too much for the Senate to swallow. They rejected it. So instead, we got the Pacific Solution, which still just sounds so fucking evil, doesn't it? It's
why? Name me one thing from history that's been called a solution that was bad in any way.
I can't think of anything.
Interesting.
So while the Tampa refugees were sent to Nauru, some of them then went to New Zealand. A handful were stuck on Nauru for years. The Pacific Solution removes offshore islands from Australia's migration zone, so asylum seekers had no automatic right to apply for refugee status if they'd arrived there, places like Christmas Island. And it introduced offshore processing on Manus and Nauru. What did Labor do?
They went and did that too.
They said, yeah, we'll allow it. we'll allow it. The Greens did not. We opposed it very clearly. Bob Brown said, quote, the immediate reaction to the Greens, very vocally opposing those laws and this approach from Howard was a barrage of abusive mail, including bullets and pictures of nooses, and then 3 months later, a doubling of the Greens vote across the nation. Little bit of foreshadowing there. So back to the present, though. So this has just happened, and then that was in August, and then 9/11. So 9/11 happens, George Bush declares a war on terror, and John Howard says, absolutely, sir, how high? We will join you. We will back you to the hilt all the way. As the US invades Afghanistan, Australia sends support. John Howard at this time also quite deliberately, Paddy Manning says, links the, quote, terrorism risk, this war on terror, with boat arrivals, implying that likely everyone who is arriving on a boat seeking asylum to Australia is a terrorist.
Man, there's literally a court decision that sort of happens either side of the attacks, right? A court decision relating to the legality of Australia's actions in regards to Tampa. And I believe the judge is literally considering his decision over that May weekend period or around the 9/11 attacks. Then the attacks happen and everything changes, right?
Yeah, it would.
Because it's crazy because at this point, I mean, yes, the number of people arriving by boat was increasing, but of course was nowhere near the numbers that people would later see. And often the debate around the numbers is there. But no, Howard makes it about the quality or the makeup of these people and how much of a potential terrorist threat they are, even though these people are overwhelmingly innocent people, or that they are innocent people. They're women and children who are fleeing the very regime that we will now join the US in invading to try and defeat in Afghanistan. For fuck's sake.
That's right. It's like, how can you acknowledge on the one hand that there is this threat that is so significant that we need to go and invade, that we need to invade Afghanistan. But then when people flee, you're like, no, they're terrorists. Anyway, they don't deserve our protection. Yeah. I was too young, to really know what was happening at this time. I don't know if you remember the vibe of the time.
Oh, I mean, yes, I'm in grade 6. I sort of remember it happening. Obviously can't really compute all the ramifications of it. I know John Howard is bad. I can lock that in.
Same.
And I remember we want Kim Beazley to win. I remember that being the general vibe of my household. But I just remember, I mean, it's all sort of mixed up with my memory of later researching a lot of this because I did a show a few years ago about this kind of stuff. Yes, what was I actually thinking at the time. Yeah. I was on the correct side of the issue. Let's be sure about that. Yeah.
Yes, me too, at age 6. Apparently what Paddy Manning kind of points out, which is interesting, is that in contrast with the Tampa issue where the Greens were so clear from the outset, had a really strong position, the Greens seemed a little bit more wobbly or just kind of unclear in relation to the war on terror. Bob Brown and the Greens were calling for, basically my read of it is like sensible restraint. Like just let's be a little bit sensible. They wanted an exit strategy, but they didn't oppose the war outright. Bob Brown later said the initial invasion was, quote, justified because the Taliban was sheltering Osama bin Laden. But he did oppose sending Australian troops, which of course then prompted outlets like the Herald Sun to say that Bob Brown was, quote, siding with the Taliban.
Classic.
Really good stuff.
Now, I don't think that's a great position. I think we now know, or potentially may have known at the time, that there was a point at which the Taliban was offering to give bin Laden up without an invasion, to prevent an invasion. But that wasn't good enough for the US. So that was not the correct position there. But yes, and also seems to be a contradiction in terms that the invasion is justified, but not for our young people, seems a bit bizarre.
Yes.
But,
yeah, I think so too. But that's what's happening, and it's election time, baby. We're heading into the 2001 federal election. The dirty, dirty Democrats. This really seems like the point where the Greens and the Democrats are like fucking hate each other. I feel like Bob Brown starts to really hate the Democrats. They did a preference deal with Labor, meant to be our preference deal, with no policy concessions.
Jesus Christ.
So while the Greens had gone, no, we're not going to do a deal with you unless you give us something out on the environment, they're holding out for that. The Democrats swoop in and go, we'll give you something for nothing. Meanwhile, the Greens are also, quote, punishing Labor for supporting offshore processing by not directing preferences to them in key seats in the lower house, like Brand. So I would imagine most of the relevant, preference negotiations for us at that point are in the Senate. But this is what they're doing in the lower house. It was unclear to me from the book whether they're saying, like, presumably that doesn't mean that we were putting Liberals above Labor. I would say it probably just meant not running, like not recommending preferences, presumably, an open ticket or whatever.
Not putting how to vote cards out there. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. The Greens Senate vote ultimately nearly doubled to 5%, but we were still outpolled by the dirty Democrats. One Nation preferences squeezed the Greens out in WA, but in New South Wales, Kerry Nettle got in with their preferences. This is a quote from the book. The Greens put One Nation last everywhere, and no side deal was done in New South Wales, according to Nettle, who says someone in her office was civil one day when One Nation called up, and the Greens wound up above the Democrats. And, like, I don't know if he's trying to imply that I don't really know what that's about. I think it's quite a funny idea that someone in One Nation just, like, called up and they were like, you know what, they're not so bad. Let's preference them. It might have something more to do with the fact that it seemed as though the Democrats were, like, as Paddy Manning says, their entire campaign effectively was about opposing One Nation, so it probably makes sense. But I guess Greens were also very anti-One Nation. That was, like, one of their core issues for the previous election. So anyway.
It seems like it's much of a muchness, and One Nation are notoriously pretty loose and fast and loose, and whether there's much of a incredible political strategy going on inside that organisation is pretty much up for debate, I would argue. Yeah. So they probably had a dartboard and just threw something in.
Yeah, and got a Green elected. So
thank you, Pauline.
Thank you
so
Pauline.
Much.
We owe you. No. This is also the election where we get a little bit more money. We got $10,000. We used this $10,000 donation from the manufacturing union for ads in the, quote, gay press and in SBS, which apparently, I don't know exactly what this is based on, but Paddy Manning says that helped to grow the, quote, ethnic vote. So,
Well, I wonder if, our stance on stuff like Tampa and talking about the war on terror might be.
I wonder if surely the ads would have related to that, right? Like it would have been about the Greens supporting refugees. Who knows?
Yeah.
Apparently there were big gains for the Greens in inner city in Melbourne and Sydney especially. Seats like Melbourne, Batman, Kooyong, Sydney, Grayndler, Richmond. Paddy Manning says, quote, the story of the Greens has in some way been defined by this handful of prize electorates ever since. Which in some way kind of true. Like I put that list of seats there because many of them are very familiar. Obviously, Melbourne, and then looking at seats like Richmond, Kooyong have been target seats, but it has changed somewhat since 2022 because at this point, Queensland, and for a long time, Queensland just wasn't even in the picture.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, again, the book's written in 2018. Batman, now Cooper, which has obviously changed its makeup as a seat a little bit too, but was obviously, we were in there with a chance when Alex Patel came close, when she went from watching Bob Brown talk about Tampa in 2001 to getting close to winning that seat. But yes, I think it's fair. From the perspective of 2018, those are the seats that the Greens were making gains in, and the conversation was always about, okay, which is the next one? It's got to be one of these. And
it's like Sydney and Melbourne. That's, inner city, Sydney, Melbourne. Those are the chances.
For sure.
But after all that, the Liberals were returned, despite a small swing against them. The Greens only won that one new senator, didn't even get over the reimbursement threshold of the 4% in South Australia or Queensland in the Senate. But they had gained new recognition as not just a one-issue party. This is what the post-election review said.
Great.
And I think it's fair to say, right? I thought this was very kind of an interesting, blunt take from Bob Brown, though, in this internal memo that he distributed following the 2001 election. It said, quote, our policy stand won us votes but lost us seats.
I don't get that. Can you explain that to me?
I wondered if it sounds similar to the take on the Queensland election in a way where our vote statewide held steady and we gained new ground outside of those target inner city seats that was, likely based on this broad-based populist economic platform, cost of living relief and housing and everything, but that didn't help us win any of those target seats in the inner city.
But when he says lost to seats in 2001, is he seriously thinking that we're in with a chance in a lower house seat? He must just be talking about the Senate.
No,
right?
he would be talking about the Senate, I think.
Yeah. Okay, right.
And I don't know and maybe that was me applying my own like immediate things to what he's probably talking about standing by their policy and not trading, like not backing down that in order to get preferences is what fucked them over in the Senate.
Okay, right. Interesting.
I think that, and actually reading on that makes more sense, because then the book goes on to talk about how Bob Brown says, okay, we need a new approach to preferences. We need to coordinate negotiations so that Senate and House negotiations are happening at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
We want to trade preferences with Labor, but we need to set this clear expectation still that there will be no lower house preferences without a policy exchange, like a policy outcome. Brutal and true from Bob on this strategy was that, like, unlike the Liberals, quote, Labor has no policy principles but is keen on trading Senate preferences for House preferences. How do we keep our scruples but not lose out to this unprincipled dynamic? And that was referring to them giving the Democrats preferences, despite the Democrats' record on like anti-Labor, anti-industrial relations reform, for example. Yes.
Why can't we have stronger policy positions like the Liberals and not be up for trading our?
But it's true. Like what he's getting at is that the Liberals aren't going to trade preferences with us because their policies are actually very different to us. Labor is kind of like doesn't really care, but there's got to be something in it for them.
Yeah. And I guess, yes, the only reason Liberals do preference us is to fuck over Labor, as they have done before.
Yeah.
God, it's so good that we don't have to worry about this shit anymore, I must say. Or like when the totality of – I'm not saying we don't worry about preferences. Preferences obviously still have an effect. We've seen that happen. But at least from a party point of view, we'd be like, we list out how to vote according to who's the least shit to the shittest. And we have enough of a support base to win seats on our own, Yeah.
I did think this was interesting, though. Maybe it's kind of a middle ground, because I think it was in the last chapter, or maybe just in the first part of this chapter, we had that suggestion from Lee Rhiannon that we take kind of the opposite preference negotiations approach to Bob, in that we use preferences to win seats, not policies. And I guess Bob Brown is like, well, we can use the lower house to win policies and the upper house to win seats. It seems like a little bit of a shift from him.
Right. Okay.
Anyway, this is kind of part of, I think, like this unified, we really need a really clear and coordinated approach to preference negotiations is part of this like centralization and professionalization of the party. This is around the time that we also start pooling resources from electoral reimbursements to fund the Australian Greens and a think tank, Hello Green Institute, and to support the, quote, struggling South Australian and Queensland branches. But this didn't... Yes, that suggestion didn't go over well with everyone. Can you guess with whom? New South Wales didn't want to, as usual, and a shitstorm broke out. The Treasurer resigned. There were classic, like, whiny internal email chains, the equivalent of, what now would be these long comment threads in the internal Facebook groups. Basically that. Seems like that was going on. And this is also the time that Bob Brown decides to tell the media that the Greens would support selling off the remaining 50.1% stake the government held in Telstra in exchange for ending land clearing, especially in Queensland, and old growth forest logging.
Because,
can you imagine?
Once again, he is a tree. He will do anything to support trees like him. He's always putting the interests of trees like himself first.
That's true. That's true. I just can't imagine now, for example, like you read a media headline that Adam Bant has just stood up in front of a press conference and been like, yeah, we would consider selling off, privatizing Medicare. I don't know, some other prized public institution if it would save the trees.
Yep.
Fucked.
It's it'd be like AVC for wind farms or something.
Yes, ABC. Yeah, that's right. That's the equivalent, isn't it? And I think the point is that, Bob had just freestyled this, which he seems to admit. I think that he did say, well, I'm saying this, but I'll listen to the party. And thank God he said that, because then obviously National Council says, fuck no.
No.
And he has to walk it back. Kerry Nettle publicly rules out any future support for privatisation. I did think, though, that Bob Brown's comments, like, they have a sting of it's a really interesting quote from him on this in the book, because it's kind of contrite and like humble, and, you know, well, as a leader, you just have to go by what the party says. But it seems a little bit sassy to me. Quote, I said yes, I'd talk to Howard about the sale of Telstra if it would save Tasmania's forests. I had to humbly back down, and a motion was put forward censuring me for venturing such an idea. I was quite content, and afterwards watched Telstra being sold and the Tasmanian forest logged. I guess the point he's making being that, well, maybe we could have had one and not the other of that. I was being smart.
Emerald, he's a gay man. We're very bitchy, okay? We don't let things go
so
very
bitchy. It really is.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because isn't there a quote from someone else in the party, I can't remember now in the book, who says, when I saw that Bob had to walk it back, I was like, oh, that's an example of the Greens being different. Was it Christine Milne maybe, or Lee Rhiannon?
Yes,
was it
actually, maybe Christine Milne, but that's right. Like, it's held up as an example of, oh, I'm proud to be in a party that does respect the members enough that the leader can kind of be pulled into line and held to the wishes of the members who don't want Telstra sold.
For Lee Rhiannon, the moment Nettle stood by the platform was the moment she knew that the party had a strength that was greater than any individual. So I guess, you know, you have to have moments like these to test that principle and to see it in action, I suppose. But yes, the idea that the leader just throws around such a massive change in direction, betraying fundamental principles of the Greens Party, is a little bit weird. And I must say, Bob's sort of comments like, oh, I always did the right thing. I always respected the decision of the members. Like, hang on, we read like 4 paragraphs ago that you overruled membership's choice of a candidate, right? And I mean, again, we see it in the debate surrounding whether or not the party should have an elected leader. Yeah, there are some figures in the party who fought very hard, massive parts of the movement, had big wins, have got themselves into a position in which they're either MPs or, you know, substantial power brokers within the party, who just need to be reminded that, like, no, you're not more important than the role of the membership. Like, you've got to be committed to this grassroots democracy thing, and we should have it expanded as much as possible, and no one should be bigger than that. Yeah.
And it's unsurprising, right, that this comment comes from Lee Rhiannon, because the New South Wales Greens, I mean, it might sound like we're kind of making fun of them for always blocking shit and being troublemakers, but they have a strong tradition of like staunchly standing by and living out principles of grassroots participatory democracy. And yes, on issues of, you know, leadership, for example, that's one. The other is, yes, the issue of conscience votes, and the way that the New South Wales Greens have always been very clear that their MPs are bound to the policies that are decided by members, whereas the party room rules, which were developed right around this time in 2001, 2002, maybe 2003, are about the caucus of MPs making decisions, and that includes electing the leader. It includes making a decision on how they vote on bills. There's a little bit in the book which I didn't write down too many notes from, but yes, kind of how those party room rules were developed, and there were proposals at National Council to do things a bit more democratically, but they couldn't reach consensus. Bob Brown moves for a vote, and ultimately they get to just keep the party rules that the MPs had written, and it's effectively that way to this very day, and that's why we don't have a democratically elected leader.
Right.
And that's pretty cooked. As anyone who, you know, if you've been listening to the show for a long time, you know Tom's and my view on the fact that we should be democratically electing our leader. But if you don't know now, you know. Anyway, despite all this drama, the Greens are really beginning to grow. Like, we're on the up and up around this period. The Greens got 18% statewide in the 2002 Tasmanian election, which is fucking huge. Like, I would like to know whether the Greens have ever got more than that statewide.
And this is after they did their dodginess, right? Restructuring the Tasmanian Parliament to try and squeeze the Greens out, right? To try and get rid of us.
Major parties teamed up to be like, we're going to squash the Greens.
Yep.
They fucking failed. 3 new Greens MLAs were elected to the Tasmanian Parliament to join Peg Putt, including Kim Booth, Tim Morris, and a little guy by the name of Nick McKim.
There he is.
That's right. This is also, so the Greens were kind of they'd gone from like 2 or 3%, they get to 5%. Now they are hitting the big old 10% in the polls as the membership grows. 10% is, of course, the sad little barrier that we tend to hover around still. Arguably, the Greens kind of hover in 11, 12 now, but it seems like the party is hitting its stride. But as we grow, we face new questions and concerns.
This I laughed out loud when I read this. Go on.
Yes. So
this is Bob Brown, right? This is Bob saying this?
Yeah. I think yes, Bob Brown. Will the influx weaken our policy base? Will we get too big? How can we handle such growth? And then I think this is definitely the quote from Bob Brown. Quote, our mission is to supplant economic rationalism with humane values, and we can only succeed one way, by winning the support of more people than support the ecocrats. We must not fear popularity.
One of my greatest fears in this life is popularity. I'm so terrified of it.
But isn't this telling? Like it is such a funny quote that it's like, for a politician running an electoral project with a party that is trying to win votes, to have to say to everyone that we must not fear popularity is interesting.
But I mean, he's probably addressing serious concerns. I mean, again, so we reached 10% in the polls. The membership had hit 5,000 across the country, right? We're at what, 15, 16,000 these days, But so obviously there've been a sudden increase. But yes, people were genuinely worried about this new influx of people joining their political party.
Well, and I kind of get that. I mean, yes, there's politics is a paranoid domain by necessity. Like, sure. I wish I knew where this quote came from. I remember seeing it in one of my uni courses once, that it's like, there's no such thing as paranoia in politics because everyone really is out to get you. And maybe it's a spin on war. But anyway, like, it's true. And I've also been in branches where lots of new members start signing up, and some members go, whoa, maybe we hold off on ratifying these new members. Something might be going on here. There's that paranoia about kind of getting infiltrators, but probably more to the point, at this time it would have been paranoia that these new members are coming in and they're changing the Greens. And I don't know, I don't like their new ways of operating. Maybe a lot of them want to talk about a lot more than the environment, blah-de-blah. I saw in the book, Paddy Manning said that there was like a forum or an internal workshop or something, and the title was something like New Members, Opportunity or Threat?
Oh, God. I don't know. It's just like, it feels like teenagers in a band being like, okay, so when we win our 4th Grammy, what are we going to... Like, how are we going to handle that?
So
let's be friends, no matter how big we get.
We need to discuss this.
We should not fear, guys, please do not fear popularity. Please do not
fear popularity. Also, a quick moment for the term ecocrat.
Yeah.
Did that ever catch on?
Well, Paddy Manning has a sick after it, so he thinks it's an error. I thought iconocrats. Iconocrats is something that I've heard before. I've never heard ecocrats before.
Okay, because I was like, aren't the Greens the ecocrats? I don't know. Right?
Oh, right. By winning the support of more people than support the ecocrats. No, I think it's economics. I think it's iconocrats.
Iconocrats is what they mean.
Economic technocrats. Yeah, I think that's what
I see. I see. Yes. Well, so the Greens are growing. Part of the story is just rising support for the movement. It's standing up for refugees, all the things that the Greens are doing. It's also the fact that the Democrats start to implode. They have that leadership struggle in 2002, and things all seem to pretty much go downhill from there. And so there are lots of little Democrat voters and members looking for a home, I would say.
Yeah, it was sort of the 3 things at once, right? Cheryl Kernot leaving to join Labor.
Yes.
them supporting the GST and this Meg Lees versus Natasha Stott-Despoja fight.
Yeah.
You're probably too young. Natasha Stott-Despoja was like quite a thing for quite a while. She was like, she's a very attractive lady, well-spoken, passionate, young. She was funny on like The Glass House with Will Anderson. Okay. She was, a bit of a thing.
I kind of gathered that. Yes, I wasn't aware of her, but I get that impression in retrospect. So the Greens are growing and decide to hold kind of this structural review by an independent reviewer. Well, I guess they weren't independent. Was it a member? Anyway, this person, Margaret Blakers, is meant to hold this review to address the growth and the risks and the opportunities, and also the fact that there are kind of growing rifts and conflicts, particularly between, New South Wales Greens and Australian Greens. But these big questions about how centralised should the party be? How much funding should the Australian Greens get? What power should they have over the member bodies? Should there be member bodies at all? Christine Milne said that the Greens should abolish member bodies, being the states and territories, on the basis that, like, using the logic that apparently in the Greens policy, I don't know if this is still the case, is it, that the Greens wanted to abolish state governments?
Yeah, that does ring a bell. I think it's one of those policies that we're like, that's in the policy platform, but we never talk about it or never do anything about it. Yep.
Yeah. Well, effectively, Christine Milne was like, well, we want to abolish state government, so we should abolish the state bodies, and we can have like branches, and then we can have the Australian Greens.
That's a bit
And I
nuts.
think it's an ever-present issue, because if, should you have a strong central body that then supports the states that aren't doing so well, or is it like, well, each member body should organise and kind of stand up for themselves and also have some level of autonomy to run their group in the way that they want to. Paddy Manning says, quote, as things stood, the party was dividing into rich states, New South Wales and Victoria, and poor states, the haves and have-nots of the Greens. Meanwhile, the centre was totally underfunded. I was like,
how would you run like state elections and stuff like that? Wouldn't that be a bit of an extra nightmare?
We've still got state government. I mean, I guess in theory, the federal body, or you could still do it by branches. Like in theory, branches run state elections, right? Like they pick a candidate, and then the local campaign would run. And I guess if they needed oversight, it would come from the federal campaign body. I don't know. I wondered if it's too boring to talk. I just wanted to point out that there is still, maybe there's still a point of contention over whether the Australian Greens, like the central body, should get more or less funding. That's probably, I don't know if there's much there, but it is an interesting conversation, because like there are questions about centralisation and how that affects grassroots democracy versus allowing the party to be more effective. I don't know. The other proposals that were made around this time as part of this review that I thought were interesting was tithing, not just MPs, but members. So members who had over a particular income level would have to pay a certain proportion of their income towards the party. Interesting. I don't hate it. But anyway, so Margaret Blakers is running this review. She wants to go and talk to everyone about it. She hops in her Subaru and drives around the country for a listening tour to all of the little Greens branches around the country, apparently slipped a disc driving 15,638 kilometres because she's just spending all this time in her car. And
the party gave her petrol money, right?
The party gave her petrol money. Very kind. I thought this was kind of sweet that apparently a lot of the places that she went, she would rock up at these branches, she would go to branch meetings and meet with, grassroots Greens members. And a lot of them didn't even know that the Australian Greens as a body existed. Paddy Manning says that like they knew obviously of Bob Brown, they knew that there were these federal MPs, but they didn't know that there even was a central body. Right. And I would say that's quite different now. Like I think Australian Greens are definitely a bit more well-resourced and present now as a, whatever, it's not an organisation, but as part of the organisation of the Australian Greens. Apparently it seems like nothing really came out of this it was a lovely thought to review what's going on in the party and try and figure out how we can make things better, but no one could agree on anything. And so,
she drove 15,000 kilometres around the fucking country and got nothing.
Yeah, she got back and
Blankets.
everyone just argued and couldn't come to consensus, and so nothing really happened.
She's just like, my fucking back, you pieces of shit.
She's like, for nothing. Although in 2003, the WA Greens did finally join the Australian Greens, and so we've got a complete set, baby. And it sounds like, we started to sort out our finances. We started to get a little bit better at doing things properly. Paddy Manning finishes the chapter with, quote, the Greens had begun a slow transition from an activist-led social movement group to a centralised professional electoral party.
Well, just before then, I thought was really interesting that, we talk about, Dobie's afraid of new popularity and these new members, but it seems to be that a lot of these new members were more right-wing than you would expect, were more conservative. It was weird, right? Like, so what do we got here? So he mentions this workshop, new members, opportunity or threat. One-time convener Stuart Jackson found that a fifth of the joiners after 2001 were ex-Labor, disgusted at their party's abandonment of principle, particularly on Tampa. I joined the Greens because of Kim Beazley, one staffer told Jackson. He was appalling as a version of the opposition, and I thought if there's no decent opposition, we must be doing something to create an opposition, and therefore I joined, which, there's echoes of that today, right? Adam Bant saying, hey, we're the real opposition.
Yeah.
New members came from the Democrats and the Liberals as well, of course, and going by Jackson's survey, they were broadly more right-leaning. Those that joined most recently, from 2001 to 2008, strongly disagreed with moving the party to the left. They do not see being left-wing as a positive move for the party.
So do you think that that's talking about, like, economically left or socially left? That there's a
bizarre, right? I guess we'd have to look at the methodology of such a survey and how it plays out. But you would think, again, the Tampa Greens particularly, I mean, obviously there's a...
Why else would they be joining?
Yes, there's an attraction to human rights. That there can be people who can be economically conservative and still concerned about human rights. Not everyone's ideologically
Maybe they saw
consistent.
that the Greens were going to sell off Telstra and they were like, that's a movement I want to be part of.
These
Bob
guys
Brown was
gets
right.
it. Literally tree Tories. Telstra for tree Tories, yeah. But, so funny. It's like, I'm leaving Labor to go to the Greens, but, hey, don't you guys move any further to the left. That's a bad look for you. Fascinating.
Yeah, I don't know.
People don't know, if you follow all this Luigi Maggioni stuff, it's like he's all over the ideological map. No one's politics really makes sense.
Except ours, which are perfect.
Yes, correct.
That's right. Well, we will leave it there because we're now up to the start of Chapter 8. I expect that we will have to split Chapter 8, taking a stand, also into two parts because there is a lot going on. Even just at the start, there's like Iraq War, Bali bombings, Richard Di Natale and Sarah Hanson-Young also enter the scene. The Greens win their first lower house seat. Bush visits Parliament, the classic Bob Brown, Kerry Nettle protest. There's a bunch of state elections, attacks on the Greens, questions about leadership come up. And then it goes right up to kind of heading into the 2007 election with climate on the agenda.
Now, our first lower house seat, this is this
That's
like weird by-election thing that lasts for
not
like
at a
40 seconds.
Election.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah. It's not Adam.
Still counts. Still fucking counts. Well, thank you very much for taking us through that, Emerald Moon. And thank you, Paddy Manning, as always, for writing Inside the Greens. God bless you.
And thanks, patrons, for being a patron, subscribing, supporting the show. We love you so much. We hope you have a blessed new year.
Indeed. We love your feedback too. Anytime, send us a message via Patreon. If you have suggestions for other episodes, more conversations you want us to get into, we'd love to hear that stuff anytime. You can always email us, hello@seriousdangerpod.com, or just send us a message at patreon.com/seriousdangerau.
Oi.
Oi.
Serious Danger Australia.